Number 1. When I was a kid, we'd go to these beach cabins in Maryland, right by the Chesapeake. They were small, rustic ordeals with basic comforts, nothing fancy like TVs or air conditioning. It had 2 bedrooms and a cot in the kitchen, and my siblings and I rotated on the cot so that no one got too sore from it. A small tradition of ours was that my mother and I would have a hot cup of tea right before bed in our summer jammies. This was just our way of relaxing, while everyone else went off to read or listen to music or whatever. Well, one night, I was settling onto the cot when she picked up the tea kettle to fill it. Out of the corner of my eye, I see her flinch, and then say, in a steady voice, "What are you doing there?" My head whipped over to the kitchenette to see her looking out of the window. Then she jumped back and screamed for my father. Somehow, he knew shit was getting real, and he ran from the back bedroom and barely paused to see my mum point towards the left side of the house. He burst out of the door and to the left side of the cabin. I'll be the first to admit, I ran like a motherfucker, and I baseball slid under my parents' bed, because, damn it, I was 10, and that's what kids do when they're terrified. I still remember the smell of the old wood and the feel of my teddy bear, shielding me from whatever the hell was going on outside. I remember seeing my 14-year-old brother, then a medium-ranking karate student, follow my dad out of the cabin at full speed. The rest of the story is an amalgamation of what I heard and what my family filled in for me. My father, a former army sergeant and MP with a Bronze Star, managed to tackle the guy who had been peeping into our kitchen. He put him into an elbow lock face down on the ground. My brother was standing sentinel over both of them, while my mother ran to get the cell phone we'd bought just 2 weeks earlier. This was '95, when those suckers still had cords and everything. While my mum called 911, I remember hearing the guy talking. He was saying things like, "The Ouija board fucking told me. I want the devil to suck my fucking brains out. Satan is in cabin 10. I have to get to cabin 10. The devil wants me to kill myself." Just freaky stuff like that. We were in cabin 3, over a half a mile away from where he apparently intended to meet the devil. My dad kept a grip on him for probably a good 15 minutes before the cops showed up. The first thing out of one of their mouths was, "Jamie, when did they let you out?" Turns out, he'd been released from jail just 2 weeks earlier for arson. You know where he was standing when my mum saw him at the window? Right beside the propane tank. Number 2. This situation is still developing, and I am afraid for my mother's safety. We've reported this to the police, and they've patrolled the area a few times, but they don't seem to be taking it seriously. If you have any suggestions or theories, I would greatly appreciate it. My mum and I live alone in the rural Midwest. Our closest neighbours are about a mile away. On Thursday morning, my mum walked to her car to find small pieces of paper blowing around in the grass around her car, and a bag sitting on top. The notes are very disturbing and sexually graphic. Some of them imply that he is watching her, and that he could see her at that very moment. Inside the bag were 2 glass dildos. She is not a very social person. She doesn't have any enemies or even friends who would do this. She, of course, reported it to the police straight away. One of our neighbours drove by our house that same morning and noticed a man in his 20s with rotting teeth and brown hair walking down our gravel road away from our house. They asked him his business, and he claimed to be waiting for a ride, indicating that his car had broken down or something. That night, a man fitting that description knocked on our door, the one that we never use. She was alone, so she turned the lights off and called the police. They didn't arrive for 45 minutes. She said he was wearing a black cowboy hat and carrying 2 large bags. He looked just like our neighbour had described, only this time he was close enough for her to notice freckles as well. A little while ago, we noticed he had been in our garage and had stolen 2 full cans of gas. There's lots of outbuildings and land and hills and trees for him to hide. My house has a lot of windows. We've begun keeping the doors locked and the windows and curtains shut. I'm currently extremely paranoid and terrified. My mum is mostly angry, and I don't think she should have to feel unsafe in her own home. What do we do? Why would a person do this? I will respond to questions as I can. On the screen now are pictures of the notes. If you are interested in receiving updates about this story, or if you have anything to add or suggest to the original poster, you can find a link to the thread in the description below. Number 3. I was out hunting in northern Ontario. No roads, except for logging roads, within 130 kilometers. I was late on the bear season, so no one was out hunting in my quadrant. I found a nice camp spot along the side of a river, and I hunted from there. On the second day of my hunt, I found a set of bear tracks. I tracked it for about 2 hours, and then I turned around. This is when things get really weird. I always track on one side of the tracks, and I return on the other. Around 200 meters down the east side of the tracks, I ran into another human footprint, which disappeared across the trail and into the woods on the west. My dog, a Czech wolf dog, didn't seem to smell anything, so I returned to the camp with minimal concern. I got back to camp at around 7:30 at night. I made a quick dinner, and I had a cigar by my camp. At around midnight, I heard a snap of a branch. After hunting for 20 years, you know that only 2 things snap branches: bears and humans. I grabbed my firearm and a flashlight, and I went out after the noise. Every 100 yards, I would scan with my flashlight. My dog started freaking out, started growling and advancing into the woods slowly. I pulled back on his leash to slow his advance, and I switched on my flashlight. I saw a pair of eyes staring right back at me. They stared for about 5 seconds and then disappeared into the woods. On the walk back to the camp, I felt anxious, scared, and uncomfortable. I could feel someone watching me. The next night, the same thing happened. My dog was going more wild than I had ever seen him go before. He was whimpering, growling, and clearly very anxious. At this point, I was terrified. I didn't go hunting that day, and I didn't close my eyes once. That night, I sat up with my flashlight, constantly scanning the tree line. I guess I dozed off at around 1, and I woke up again at 3. I was sweating, confused, and scared. I scanned the forest, and just barely visible, about 25 yards in the forest, there was a man and his dog. He was staring right at me, just as he was before. I started to approach him, shouting to him. I got to within 10 feet. He looked awfully disheveled, and he stank. The worst part was, even though he just kept staring at me smiling, his eyes showed zero emotion. He then whispered, "Good night." I ran back to my tent, packed it up into my pack, and I loaded it onto the trailer of the ATV, and I drove the hell out of there. Number 4. First off, I'd like to state that I'm a teen male, about average height and weight, but I would like to think that I'm strong for my age. Anyway, this particular night, I was at a little get-together at one of the parks in the city with a few teens around my age. It was a lot of fun. Everyone was laughing and eating hot dogs cooked over the fire. As it began to get dark, I decided to stay out a little longer than I had planned, because I was honestly having so much fun. This was my first mistake, as I was also planning to bike home. I was probably around a 20-minute bike ride away from my house. As it was getting darker and darker, I finally decided it was time to go home, so I said goodbye to all of my friends and began biking home in the light of the dimly lit streetlights. I lived in a fairly big city, so there was no lack of traffic, but certainly no one walking on the sidewalks, seeing as it was probably around 11 PM or so. I was biking for a good 10 minutes when I came to a fork in the road, where I could either stay on the lit sidewalks or take a dark shortcut on an eerie pathway. Now, this was Canada, and it was October, so it was very cold, so I ignored my gut feeling and I took the shortcut. This was my second mistake. A few minutes down the dark trail, I decided to pull out my phone for light so I could see where I was going, even though my phone had hardly any battery left. I biked for a good while on a barely visible path with the aid of my cell phone, when I heard bushes being moved, and I could hear the crunching of the dry leaves. This, of course, frightened me, as I was out all alone at night, so I took my eyes off the path and I pointed my phone light to where I heard the noises, only to see a man, dressed in all black, looking at me. He must have been about 6'3", and he was just staring. I have never seen such a deranged look in someone's eyes. It was truly disturbing. I was too scared to say a word. The man lunged at me, trying to grab me. Before I had time to process anything, I started pedaling faster than I have ever pedaled before. I can't even describe how close he came to grabbing me. I swear I felt the wind from his arm hit me. He must have only been centimeters away. I didn't stop for anything. I just kept going and going. About a minute, or maybe even less, my phone died. I had no light whatsoever after that. I couldn't even see the path in front of me. I was so scared that the man was following me and trying to get me, so I bombed it all the way back home and I locked my door. I have never been so scared in my life. If I had decided to walk that evening instead of bike, or if my phone had died just a minute sooner, I truly believe that that man dressed in all black would have gotten what he wanted from me. I'm just glad I never got to find out exactly what that was. Hi guys, Lazy here, and thank you very much for listening. And also a big thank you to everybody who sent me in their story for this episode. Just because yours wasn't featured in this video doesn't mean it won't be used in a future one as well, so keep an eye out for yours at a later stage. And also, if you want to have a chance for your story to be narrated, then make sure to send it in to me. My email is in the description box. Make sure to check out Anthony's artwork. He did the thumbnail for this video and pretty much every other video I've ever done. And you'll hear from me again very, very soon. Stay spooky. And remember, the best things happen in the dark.